Hello students, welcome to the MOOC, the Political Economy Course 2, and the topic for our discussion is imperialism as a political phenomenon. Imperialism, as you know, is connotative of a relationship of domination and subjugation. Domination that is exercised by a more powerful country over a country which is less advanced or powerful. According to Morgenthau, it refers to territorial expansion of any state beyond its original jurisdiction. Now, what are the factors that gave rise to an old style or earlier imperialism, which is often called colonialism? First, it could be because of a desire to assert one's national superiority. Aggressive nationalism or perverted nationalism is the basic cause. Often a country tries to clamp down political rule on another country because it wants to assert its supremacy. We have seen this in case of Hitler, who tried to assert the superiority of the German race. Even the British people came to India with the ostensible reason of trying to spread enlightenment and awareness to those dark corners of the world which were uncivilized. And that is why we are familiar with the concept of the white man's burden. In earlier times, colonialism was also occasioned by the desire on part of a country to accommodate rising population. We see America's occupation by Great Britain as a clear case of this reason. Occupation of strategically important areas could also be an allied reason. Often the big powers try to occupy areas of strategic importance in faraway lands so that they can operate in those regions from those vantage points. America's occupation of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean and its conversion into a military base is an illustration. Often, colonialism has also resulted from the desire on part of a country to propagate its ideology. So, many people feel that imperialism on part of the West was a measure to try and contain the rising spread of communism. But perhaps one of the most significant reasons behind the emergence of colonialism is furnished by Lenin, who believed that imperialism results from a logical extension and development of capitalism. What happens is this, that the domestic market of a particular industrialized country gets saturated, and after that, in their search for new markets, these colonizers clamp down political rule in different parts of the world so that those areas can be converted into domains where raw materials can be grown to feed the industries at home, and those places can also serve as markets for the finished products. And in fact, Lenin contends that the world wars are ultimately an extension of this tendency where different industrial countries try to divide the world among themselves. So the chief characteristic of colonialism, you can understand, is the establishment of a relationship of inequality, of domination and subjugation between the colonial and the metropolitan centers. And this is definitely accompanied by a sense of racial hatred, which persists in more subtle forms even after decolonization. So why is imperialism considered to be a political phenomenon? Politics, as you know, is about power. And power is basically the ability of a person or an agent or a country, whatever the case may be, to try and dominate another and make that other agent or country do something which it normally would not have done. We consider colonialism, which is the earliest form of imperialism, as basically a political phenomenon, because here the country, of course, is spurred by economic interests to draw out as much of resources and wealth from the colonized country, but this is sought to be perpetuated by clamping political rule. So India, as you know, was basically converted into British India. It did not have any independent existence or identity of its own, and this form of political control that is exercised by the colonial powers is the essence of imperialism. But imperialism has manifested itself in other forms as well. I would like to clarify the notion of neocolonialism in this context. You will understand that after the Second World War, all these European powers which were owners of colonies in different parts of the world, they were quite devastated by their involvement in the World War, and the war had cut them to size. It was not possible for them to maintain their colonies anymore, which is why they gave independence to their colonies and retreated back to their shells. Under the circumstances, the world underwent a metamorphosis. In the sense, there was large-scale de-Europeanization of politics. But thereafter, these erstwhile colonial masters were too keen to revive the relationship of domination and subjugation, which is why they devised new and surreptitious ways through which they could make inroads into their erstwhile colonies. And this is the form that we called neocolonialism. The newness or the newness of this kind of colonialism consists in the fact that there is no outright political, physical domination that is exercised by the metropolitan center, but through subtle, surreptitious, and extremely clandestine techniques, control is exerted, and there are various instruments which come to the aid of these colonial masters, may I say the erstwhile colonial masters, through which they are able to carry on the same relationship of domination and subjugation, which is why essentially imperialism remains at heart a political phenomenon. Now, this kind of domination that is exercised by the colonial masters can be discerned at various levels. At the economic level, you will find that the major instruments are the multinational corporations and even Western aid. Multinational corporations, as you know, are giant private economic companies having production facilities in different countries of the world, and they have immense capital at their disposal, which is the main source of their strength. And with the flick of a button, they can mobilize capital from one end of the earth to the other, and they have started dominating extensively throughout the third world, and they have in fact converted the third world into their happy hunting grounds. And these multinational corporations receive tremendous backing from their parent countries, because all these parent countries basically stylize themselves as welfare states, and all these welfare activities to a large extent happen to be funded by the profits generated from the operations of the multinational corporations. So multinational corporations take advantage of various pieces of legislation that are enacted in their parent countries. The American legislature, for instance, came up with the Trading with the Enemy Act, the Hickenlooper Amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act. Through such pieces of legislation, they try to create a scenario in the third world such that it is conducive to operations by multinational corporations. So if a particular third world country does not open its doors to multinational corporations or does not maintain a climate that is conducive to the operation of multinational corporations, then often there is a threat that is extended to these countries that it will not receive aid anymore. So through such measures, multinational corporations have been able to create for themselves an empire over which the sun perhaps will never set. But multinational corporations also use themselves as instruments of espionage. They carry out extensive research throughout the third world so that every part of the third world is at their fingertips, and that is basically because they want to ensure that if there is any move towards any kind of radicalism in any part of the third world, that will be immediately tackled by the Western imperialist powers. But the interesting question is, how do the multinational corporations encroach upon the policy-making space of the third world countries? Because the third world countries now are no longer operating in an era of colonialism. They are all independent sovereign states. But this sovereignty is more like a facade, because although the country remains formally independent and sovereign, there are techniques through which the policy-making process, which is technically the prerogative of the country, is encroached upon by the multinational corporations and ultimately by the Western imperialist powers. What happens is this, that the multinational corporations operate as spokespersons for their parent countries. They act on behalf of their parent countries and exert influence on the policy-making process. And these third world countries become so dependent upon the economic strength that obviously is manifested in the multinational corporations, that if the multinational corporations decide to withdraw, that can create serious economic backlashes in the third world country. And fearing such dire consequences, often the third world countries have no alternative but to connive at the pranks and the whatever is dished out by the multinational corporations. There is also another technique through which the multinational corporations encroach upon the policy-making space of the third world countries. You see, in all these third world countries, there are indigenous business groups. In India, for instance, you have the Chambers of Commerce, you have FICCI, you have ASSOCHAM. Now, all these multinational corporations, they siphon off huge amounts of aid to political parties through these business organizations, and political parties definitely need money all the time, and particularly when they have to fight and contest elections. Modern elections, as you know, have become extremely expensive processes. So that money, which is now pumped into the parties through these business organizations, is basically looked upon by the multinational corporation as some kind of an investment. So when the party comes to power after winning elections, it will obviously have to oblige the donors. It will have to play second fiddle to whatever policy changes are desired by the multinational corporations. And this is how the domestic policy-making space is encroached upon by the Western imperialist powers, operating through multinational corporations which serve as their major instruments. But you see, the interesting part is that not only domestic policy, even foreign policy is encroached upon by the multinational corporation. Unlike in the case of domestic policy, when it comes to foreign policy, there is no uniform pattern that can be discerned across the different countries of the third world. But I will still try to illustrate the point by reference to Indo-Pak relations. As you know, India has been able to forge good relations with not only her neighbors but with countries around the world ever since she became independent in 1947. Somehow or the other, Indo-Pak relations has remained a vexatious issue. And often academicians have tried to probe into this area, and they have found that whenever there is proposal for improvement of relations between India and Pakistan, there is, and usually improvement of relations between two countries is triggered off by improvement of trade, bilateral trade in particular. But it has been seen that whenever there has been proposals voiced in Pakistan for improvement in relations with India, there has been an orchestrated protest in Pakistan that this is perhaps a trap which India is trying to lay out, and Pakistan will ultimately become subservient to the Indian economy. And this kind of orchestrated protest and negative propaganda has often dissuaded Pakistan against taking positive steps towards improvement of relations with India. And that is exactly how I try to make you understand that even foreign policy is a domain which is not free from encroachment by Western imperialism operating through multinational corporations. In fact, I did also mention that the world wars that we have seen are nothing but imperialist wars fought among the industrialized countries, where each country makes an attempt to carve out as much of the world as possible so that it can have a larger share of the world market. But the interesting part is that although imperialism is basically spurred by economic interests which lie at its heart, it is basically a political phenomenon because the political domination is exerted to ensure that the economic gains continue to flow. And when these economic gains are somehow threatened from flowing into the coffers of the Western imperialist powers, the Western imperialist powers do not hesitate to resort to politico-military methods. And these are some of the important politico-military methods that I would like to draw your attention to. The establishment of military blocs, bases, and alliances like the NATO, as you know, whose aim is to combat national liberation movements. Despite their conflicts with one another, the imperialists are finding it increasingly necessary to combine their forces in order to hold back the national independence movements. Collective forms of neocolonialism, political and military, are being forged as a means for safeguarding and intensifying the exploitation of the Third World. The SEATO, the CENTO have now been supplemented by other similar organizations, and the American imperialist powers are trying to rope in as many of the countries as possible into their net, and to that extent they have sponsored various kinds of military blocs, bases and alliances throughout the Third World. And if you look into the basic character of these military blocs, bases and alliances, you will see that they have two fundamental aims behind them. First, the reason is to check the spread of radicalism or the onslaught of radicalism. SEATO, for instance, was designed to guard Southeast Asia partly after the victory of socialism in Vietnam and the birth of the People's Republic of China, which was a significant development in the post-Second World War because China seemed to have raised the hopes and aspirations of depressed people all over the world about the prospects of ushering in socialism in their respective countries. Although socialism had happened as early as 1917 in the erstwhile Soviet Union, that was treated more like a historical freak, some kind of miracle. But since the Chinese case demonstrated to the world that miracles could replicate themselves, definitely the threat of the spread of socialism was given a new lease of life by the birth of China, which the Western imperialist powers wanted to address seriously, and that is why they tried to craft out all these military blocs, bases and alliances. The other reason is that these countries which could be made parties to these alliances would come under the direct political and ideological influence of Western imperialism, who could then use these countries as bases of operation in other continents like Asia and Africa. Not only military blocs, bases and alliances, often you will find various kinds of interference on part of the Western imperialist powers. These interferences are sometimes overt and sometimes they are covert, but they are basically meant to create political instability in different parts of the Third World. Because if there is political instability in different parts of the Third World, obviously there will be more and more dependence on the Western imperialist powers, because one of the inevitable fallouts of political instability will be the lack of economic progress. And as it is that the Third World countries suffer from a resource crunch, so that will also keep them attached to the Western imperialist powers for all kinds of help and assistance, which is why political interference in the Third World is one of the antiques on part of the Western imperialist powers. One of the interesting aspects of domination, political military domination by the Western imperialist powers over the Third World, is the entanglement of the Third World in the arms race. Try to understand the point logically. There is something called scenario planning, which Western arms dealers or arms manufacturers indulge in. Do you know what this is? You see, many of the Western multinationals happen to be arms manufacturers and dealers whose huge profits come from sale of arms throughout the world. And why would countries across the world buy arms? Only when they have insecurity and political instability and they face different kinds of threats from around them. And to that extent, scenario planning is a favorite pastime of Western arms dealers. This is nothing but speculation and prospective planning on part of the Western arms dealers and manufacturers about potential areas of conflict in different parts of the world. And you will be surprised that of all the different places around the world, one of the areas topping the list is Indo-Pak relations. You see, because as long as the countries suffer from different kinds of threats and there is political hostility with their neighbors or with countries around them in the larger neighborhood, they will always try to beef up their security, and to that extent, the purchase of arms will be an inevitable outcome. And to that extent, Western arms dealers try to indulge in scenario planning, and they try to promote strife and conflict in different parts of the world so that the third world remains more and more vulnerable to conflicts, and that is what will motivate the third world countries to keep buying arms. You see, this is actually a tragic situation because Western arms manufacturers and dealers try to promote their profit at the cost of promoting instability and strife in different parts of the third world. The instability that the third world experiences results in more and more economic suffering and deprivation, and you will find that they all get caught sooner or later in what is called the gun and butter controversy. There are pressing developmental needs which stare the third world countries in the face. But this is something which they are unable to cater to because they are overwhelmed by the desire to ensure their security, which is why they have to keep borrowing in order to purchase arms. In this context, I would also like to explain the concept of Western aid, which is never aid without strings. You see, there is something misleading about the notion of aid because the third world countries are given aid not really in a spirit of help, which the name may suggest, but basically as a loan which the country will have to repay with interest. And what happens is, aid is never unconditional. Aid is always aid with strings attached. That means the country receiving aid does not really get aid if it feels the need for money. It gets aid only on the fulfillment of certain conditions. Like, for instance, it is told that it has to devalue its currency by such and such amount. It has to open its doors to multinational corporations. It has to keep the scenario conducive for operations of the Western imperialist powers. So what happens is that the aid that is extended to the country is never allowed to be used for the country to become independent and to channelize that money towards its own self-development. And that is why it is exhausted in no time, and then a large part of the aid is also siphoned off to purchasing arms. But very soon the country faces a resource crunch again because the aid has been exhausted, its loan has to be repaid. So what it has to inevitably do is to borrow money again, and this time the money that is re-borrowed is used largely to pay off the earlier debt. So this is exactly what is known as the debt trap. The country has to run, it is as if it is running on a conveyor belt. It has to run faster and faster just to stay at the same place. And that is why I say that the entire process of procurement of arms, and I have just explained to you how the third world is entangled in the arms race, the entire procedure of purchase of arms is like a double-edged sword for the third world country. Why do I say it is a double-edged sword? For two reasons. As the third world countries become involved more and more in the arms race, they make debts, and obviously they have to repay at the cost of curtailment of various developmental programs because the third world countries are generally reeling under various kinds of poverty, malnutrition, disease, and a lot of other squalor. On the other hand, the more the third world countries become involved in the arms race, greater is the profit of the neocolonial powers. This aggravates the problem of development of the third world countries and reinforces the dependence on the affluent West. And if you therefore look at the story of imperialism unfolding in the form of neocolonialism, you will realize that it is basically a form of economic domination, because I have already clarified that economic interests lie at the root of colonialism as much as of neocolonialism. But in case of colonialism, the control that was exercised was much more direct, it was blunt and blatant, and the country was controlled in every possible way: social, political, cultural, economic. It was all pervasive domination. But when we come to neocolonialism, you will find that this domination is disguised, and that is where the newness of neocolonialism lies. The country officially is sovereign and independent, but through various instrumentalities operating at the economic level, at the political military level, at the ideological cultural level, these countries have been reduced to a town rubble of the West, because the Western imperialist powers continue to dominate the third world countries in some kind of a disguised form. The disguise, I repeat, is that these countries are formally independent, but under cover of their political independence, through surreptitious, skillful techniques, the domination continues nonetheless, and it is this guise which we call neocolonialism. And that is why, because of the domination which lies at the heart of imperialism, it is basically dubbed as a political phenomenon.